Halifax, December 1917. 2,000 dead, 9,000 injured. The largest non-nuclear explosion in human history had just torn through a maritime city, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble and ash. The story everyone knows focuses on the tragedy above ground, the devastation, the fires, the heroic rescue efforts. But what almost no one discusses is what the blast revealed beneath the harbour district. And more importantly, what happened to those discoveries in the months that followed. I went to the Nova Scotia archives expecting to find standard reconstruction documentation, engineering assessments, cost estimates, rebuilding schedules. What I found instead were reports describing subsurface structures that shouldn't exist in a city founded in 1749, structures that were systematically documented, photographed, and then deliberately reburied before the public ever learned of what lay beneath their streets. The explosion tore a hole in the ground deep enough to expose layers that hadn't seen daylight in generations. When rescue workers began clearing debris from the obliterated north end, they broke through into chambers and passages that didn't match any colonial construction records. The orientation was wrong, the depth was impossible, and the stonework didn't resemble anything in the architectural catalogues of British North America. In the internal documentation from early 1918, a specific phrase appears repeatedly: unforeseen infrastructure, unexpected depth, origin unclear. These weren't casual observations. These were admissions from trained engineers that what they were finding didn't fit the accepted timeline of Halifax's history. The Halifax Relief Commission hired engineers from across North America and Europe to assess structural damage and determine whether the shattered ground could support reconstruction. Their job was practical: clear the wreckage, stabilize foundations, prepare for rebuilding. But the moment they began excavating through the blast zone, the mission changed. Between December 12th, 1917 and February 8th, 1918, engineering teams conducted 47 documented subsurface expeditions. Not rescue operations, not body recovery, subsurface expeditions. 47 separate trips into chambers and passages beneath the harbour district. For a city that was only 170 years old, that's an extraordinary number of archaeological surveys disguised as foundation assessments. One of those engineers was James Forrest, a civil engineer from Edinburgh contracted by the Relief Commission. In a private letter to his brother dated March 1918, he described what troubled him about the work. "We are not rebuilding Halifax," he wrote. "We are covering something they do not wish examined. Beneath the north end, we have found chambers of stonework superior to anything in Edinburgh's old town. Precision-fitted granite blocks, some weighing 4 to 5 tons, joined without mortar yet sealed perfectly. 4 to 5 tons. That's the weight we're talking about. Blocks of stone moved, positioned, and fitted with tolerances so tight that even with modern equipment, replicating that precision would be challenging. And this was supposedly done by colonial settlers with basic tools in the 18th century. Forrest continued, "When I asked supervisors about origin, I was told colonial French construction. But I've examined French colonial work across 3 continents. This is not French. This is not colonial. This is something they had before the British came. Perhaps before anyone came. Before anyone came. A professional engineer, trained in multiple countries. Looking at stonework he couldn't categorize within any known historical framework. And his conclusion wasn't that he misunderstood colonial architecture, His conclusion was that something existed here before the accepted settlement timeline. The photographs that survive tell their own story. 23 images remain in the public archives. Just 23, from what should have been hundreds of documentation photos. And of those 23, only 8 show the deeper structures clearly. One image, catalogued as NS-1-918-032, shows 5 workers standing inside a subterranean chamber. The ceiling arches above them in a perfect curve, approximately 5 meters high. These weren't short men. Average height for the period was about 1.7 meters, which means someone built a vaulted chamber reaching well over twice human height, deep beneath what would later become Halifax's waterfront. The stone surfaces in these photographs show something that troubles anyone who understands masonry. The blocks fit together so precisely that even in the grainy quality of 1917 photography, no mortar lines are visible. Stone on stone, edges meeting with accuracy that shouldn't be possible without modern cutting tools. And yet there it is, documented, undeniable, in photographs taken by Relief Commission engineers. In the lower section of that same image, there's something else. A channel carved into solid bedrock, with a gradient precise enough for controlled water flow. This wasn't a natural formation. This was engineered hydraulics in a foundation that officially shouldn't even exist. The engineering reports from January 1918 are remarkably detailed. They describe chamber dimensions, stone composition, joinery techniques, load-bearing characteristics. Report after report, filled with technical language and precise measurements. Chamber 7C measures 6.2 meters by 4.8 meters, height 5.1 meters. Stonework exhibits precision joinery consistent with advanced masonry technique. Recommend full documentation before infilling. Then abruptly, in late February, the language changes. The reports become vague. Subsurface structures stabilized. Reconstruction proceeding per schedule. That's it. No more measurements, no more descriptions, no more technical analysis. Just 2 sentences where there used to be pages. What happened between mid-January and late February that transformed detailed engineering documentation into bureaucratic summary? The answer appears in an internal memorandum dated February 18, 1918. Marked for internal use only, never meant for public distribution, it laid out new guidelines for documentation. It has been determined that detailed public documentation of pre-colonial structures may generate unproductive speculation regarding settlement chronology. Engineering reports should focus on reconstruction requirements rather than archaeological observations. Photographic documentation of deeper strata should be restricted to internal technical records. There it is, a direct order to stop documenting what they were finding. Not because it wasn't important, because it was too important, because it raised questions about settlement chronology that someone didn't want answered. Unproductive speculation, that's the phrase they used. As if asking why precision-engineered chambers exist beneath a supposedly young city is somehow unproductive. As if wondering who built hydraulic systems that predate any known infrastructure is mere speculation. And it wasn't just documentation that was restricted. The structures themselves were being filled in. Workers described pouring concrete into passages that had just been exposed. Chambers that had survived whatever catastrophe buried them originally were now being deliberately entombed again. Not stabilized, not preserved, destroyed. One worker, Margaret McNeil, kept a diary during the reconstruction period. In an entry from February 1918, she wrote about watching crews fill in what she called the castle walls under the harbour. She described stone passages like something from old Europe, but buried beneath our streets. They're filling them with rubble and concrete. My father says it's for safety, but the men working down there don't look like they believe that. They don't look like they believe that. Even the labourers doing the work understood something was wrong. You don't fill architectural marvels with concrete for safety. You study them. You preserve them. You try to understand them. Unless understanding them is precisely what you're trying to prevent. The deeper the excavation crews went, the more peculiar the discoveries became. Below the recognizable colonial foundations, they found strata that didn't follow the expected geological and historical progression. Different periods of construction, separated by what should have been decades or centuries, yet all maintaining the same directional bearing, the same geometric framework, the same architectural vocabulary. Different builders, different eras, don't construct in perfect alignment with structures built generations apart. They just don't. Building conventions change, techniques evolve, purposes shift. But beneath Halifax's waterfront, every layer aligned. Chambers from one period positioned precisely above chambers from another. Passages aligned with passages buried meters beneath them, as though every generation that built here was following an original design that no longer appears in any historical record. Some of the deepest chambers weren't just aligned. They were sealed, packed with blast debris so compact that workers initially thought they'd reached bedrock. But once breached, they revealed interiors that appeared undisturbed since the moment they were closed. Walls assembled with a coherence that suggested deliberate planning. Construction configurations that raised more questions than answers. And then there were the circular structures. Massive stone constructions, cylindrical, descending deep into bedrock. Officials later called them wells or old cisterns, but nothing about them corresponded to typical colonial engineering. They were too balanced, too deep, too perfectly circular, as though they'd been carved with tools capable of maintaining flawless curvature throughout their entire depth. Several were large enough for multiple men to stand inside. Others contained internal features that suggested mechanical purposes, though what those purposes might have been, no one could determine. Workers in their personal correspondence described them as engineered vessels, not wells. Constructions with a specific function that had been lost to time. The load-bearing design of certain support systems created another problem. These weren't basic colonial foundations designed to hold up wooden buildings and brick warehouses. Many were built to support something far heavier, far larger. The engineering was excessive for anything that had stood above them in recorded history, which raised an uncomfortable possibility. The waterfront structures everyone knew weren't resting on natural bedrock. They were resting on something substantially bigger. Infrastructure whose dimensions were never documented, never mapped, never explained in the authorized history of Halifax. Metal embedded in ancient stone added another layer to the mystery, not scattered randomly, but positioned deliberately, as though the stone had been shaped around it. Some fragments appeared fused, oxidized in patterns suggesting exposure to extreme heat. Yet they were located in strata supposedly predating any metallurgy sophisticated enough to produce such results. The official explanation came later. Ship debris from the explosion, colonial metal fittings scattered by the blast, But that doesn't account for why the metal appears inside the stones themselves, not on the surface. That kind of integration requires temperatures far exceeding typical forge work, far exceeding anything documented in maritime history. The kind of heat that fundamentally alters material at a molecular level. James Forrest mentioned this in another letter. Certain stone surfaces show thermal metamorphosis. The mineral composition has changed, not from age, not from weathering, but from heat. Intense, instantaneous heat, the kind that fuses sand into glass. I've seen similar effects in volcanic regions, but Halifax has no volcanic history. So what created temperatures high enough to alter granite at the molecular level, deep underground, in a region with no geological explanation for such heat? By March 1918, the excavation sites were being sealed, backfilled with rubble, covered with fresh concrete, prepared for new construction. The official reason was structural safety. The devastated waterfront needed stabilization. Reconstruction couldn't wait for archaeological surveys. But the choices about which chambers to seal first, which sections to permanently close, those decisions told a different story. The passages that were closed immediately, the ones sealed before anyone could conduct thorough documentation, were invariably the ones that challenged the official chronology most severely. The perfectly carved structures, the sophisticated water management systems, the unusual metal inclusions, the engineered passages that appeared to extend far beyond the excavation area, suggesting a network that stretched beneath the harbour long before any settlement we recognize. These passages were possibly the most enigmatic discovery of all. They weren't random tunnels. They were part of a systematic configuration, a network of corridors that seemed less like storage and more like infrastructure, oriented, calculated, organized, as though they once connected to something larger, something that extended beneath the city in ways that official maps never acknowledged. And just as quickly as they were revealed, they were hidden again. Entrances blocked, purposes unexplored, presence quietly eliminated from later reconstruction charts. When you examine the final months of the 1917 to 1918 recovery operations, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The work didn't conclude naturally. It was halted, not finished, not completed, but stopped. The further the crews proceeded, the more the character of their documentation transformed. Early entries were confident, almost procedural. By the end, the language became guarded, vague, strangely incomplete, as though someone else had suddenly taken control of what could be recorded. The final chambers they accessed weren't typical. They weren't geological formations. They weren't colonial remnants. They weren't even easily classifiable. Multiple accounts, the few that survived, described stonework that changed from recognizable to inexplicable. Walls with joints so tight you couldn't insert a blade between them. Curved passages formed with accuracy that 18th century Halifax was never supposed to possess. Platforms engineered for purposes far beyond anything recorded above them. Corridors stretching beyond the excavation area, disappearing into darkness beneath the rebuilt city. But here's what always gets buried in the official narrative. The most sophisticated chambers were the ones reinterred first. Workers described refilling complete passages, closing entrances, packing soil into spaces that had just been revealed. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. If this was solely about safety, why were the most ancient, pristine, structurally flawless chambers sealed first? Why were the most unstable, blast-damaged areas left accessible for documentation? It doesn't make sense unless those lower structures posed a different kind of danger, not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the foundations below Halifax's waterfront genuinely displayed construction methods beyond colonial capacity, and if certain chambers didn't correspond to any documented settlement at all, then the entire accepted narrative of maritime Canadian history starts to crumble. Halifax isn't unique. The same pattern appears in every major reconstruction project following urban disasters in the 19th and early 20th centuries. San Francisco, 1906. The earthquake exposed what official reports called foundations of indeterminate origin beneath the financial district, sealed during reconstruction. Chicago, 1871. The Great Fire revealed extensive subterranean infrastructure that didn't match any known construction period, covered when the city was elevated. Galveston, 1900. The hurricane uncovered stone chambers beneath the port district, filled with debris during the grade raising. London, 1666. Messina, 1908. Every disaster, same sequence. Catastrophe exposes something old. Brief documentation, rapid reconstruction, systematic reburial. As though reconstruction isn't just about restoring the city. It's about restoring the concealment. The photographs that survive from Halifax tell their own truth. Workers standing beside passages that look almost modern in their precision. Channel systems too consistent for their supposed age. Infrastructure too sophisticated for the accepted timeline. These aren't the kinds of findings historians prefer to explain. They're the kind they prefer not to discuss at all. What would it mean if modern harbour cities were built on top of something far older? Something massive? Something manufactured? Something we didn't build? What would it mean if the foundations weren't natural development, but intentional attempts by later peoples to conceal or repurpose what came before? Perhaps that's why the 1917 findings were quietly reburied. Not to protect the sites, but to protect the narrative, because admitting that precision-engineered infrastructure existed beneath Halifax before any known settlement raises questions that can't be easily answered. Questions about who was here before, what they built, what they knew, and what happened to them. James Forrest's final letter to his brother, written in April 1918, carries a tone of resignation. The work is nearly complete. The passages are sealed. The photographs have been filed away in archives where no one will think to search for them. In a generation, no one will remember what we found beneath the blast zone. It will become a footnote, if that. A strange anomaly in reconstruction reports that historians will dismiss as exaggeration or misidentification. He was right. For over a century, the Halifax discoveries have been footnotes, brief mentions in engineering journals, oddities in reconstruction budgets, nothing that generated serious archaeological inquiry, nothing that challenged the accepted timeline. But the records exist, the photographs exist, the engineering reports exist, buried in archives in Nova Scotia and Ottawa. Anyone can request them. Anyone can read the descriptions of chambers that shouldn't exist, see the images of stonework that doesn't match colonial capacity, trace the timeline of how quickly everything was sealed again. The 1917 Halifax Explosion wasn't just a tragedy. It was a window, a brief, accidental glimpse into infrastructure that predates the cities we know, into construction techniques we supposedly didn't possess, into a layer of history that's been systematically covered, not by time, but by deliberate choice. And if Halifax stands on top of structures built by people we no longer acknowledge, then the real question isn't what was revealed in 1917. It's what else remains beneath the harbour cities of the world. What other ports, what other waterfronts, what other coastal settlements were quietly reburied long before cameras existed to document them? How many times has catastrophe cracked open the ground, revealed something that challenged the accepted story, and then been sealed again before anyone could ask the right questions? The Halifax excavation was recovery work, but it was also erasure, a systematic effort to document just enough for internal records, then bury the evidence before it could generate what they called unproductive speculation. Speculation about settlement chronology, speculation about who built what we're standing on, speculation about whether the cities we inhabit are the first cities on these sites or just the most recent. The blast that devastated Halifax in 1917 killed 2,000 people and injured 9,000 more. But in the process, it did something else. It revealed foundations that weren't supposed to be there. It exposed chambers built with precision that colonials shouldn't have possessed. It opened passages into infrastructure that extended far beyond any documented settlement. And within a year, all of it was buried again, not lost to time, deliberately concealed, systematically filled, officially forgotten. The question we should be asking isn't whether this happened. The documentation proves it happened. The question is why it was hidden, and what that tells us about the history we've been taught to accept.